a real pleasure to be here speaking to you all today. Again, there are a few more of you than I was expecting. My name is Professor Jessie Ricketts, and I'm a Professor of Psychology at Royal Holloway, which is part of the University of London. So I've come over from England to see you today. And I'm going to shift focus a little bit and talk to you a bit more about upper primary and post-primary and the transition between those two phases, because that's where I've been doing a lot of my research. So actually this morning has been a fantastic setup for what I'm going to say, because you're going to see some of the same theoretical frameworks, some of the same ideas, but we're just going to shift focus up a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some background. So why would we want to focus on this transition? Why is it important? What's happening there that makes it so important that we are focusing on that? I'm going to talk a little bit about establishing together a shared understanding of what reading is. So actually, reading will mean something slightly different to all of us sitting in this room. And what Jennifer have already done, and I'm going to continue to do, is to define clearly what we mean by reading for today. That's not to say that we're not interested in all sorts of other definitions of reading. It's just that we need to take a definition for today so that we have a shared understanding of what we're talking about. I'm then going to talk a little bit about my research on reading from the transition, at the transition from primary to secondary or post-primary, and I'm going to talk a bit about what we might do next. And what I've been working on a lot recently is developing professional development resources for teachers such as yourselves, particularly in the secondary context. I'm going to share some of those resources with you. Okay, so why reading at transition then? So I probably don't need to persuade everyone in this room how important reading is. We're all here because we're really interested in reading and really engaged in thinking about literacy. But of course, reading is absolutely crucial for accessing everything that is in the curriculum. So it's really important for every subject, and it's important as you move through the school system, because actually the curriculum becomes different, it can become more complex. We also have an increased expectation that our young people will not only learn from what we tell them, but also learn through their own independent reading. So we do need them to be independent readers if that's going to work. And so it becomes even more important, I would say, as young people move into the secondary or post-primary context. And actually, you know, I don't teach in school, but I do teach my lovely undergraduate students, and it's really important for them as well. And there are still lots of literacy needs amongst our undergraduate populations as well. So we really need our young people to be able to read to learn. The other thing is that reading is important for accumulating that knowledge in the first place, but it's also really important for demonstrating that knowledge at the end. We all know of students who don't do as well as they should do in their assignments and in their assessments because they couldn't access those assessments. And so that's really important as well. So reading is not just important for school, it's also important for almost everything that we do outside of school. It's important for employment, it's important for accessing services. I've just given you one example here of a notice that's used by PISA, a few years ago in one of their assessments of reading. And actually about 20% of our young people aged 15 can't fully access this text, which may well shock you. And what that means is that there is a real health concern here. And I think it's just to illustrate the kind of challenge that we're thinking about. So we need to be thinking about reading because it's important for education, it's important for everything to do with our lives, but we also need to be thinking about reading at the transition from primary to post-primary and through post-primary because there are very high levels of need. And I'm going to show you some data on that from my own research as well. So establishing a shared understanding of reading. So Jennifer have really set this up for me. So I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but I'm going to start by saying, and this kind of draws on the simple view of reading that we've seen already. If you've got a text in front of you, there are two things that you absolutely need to be successful in that reading task. You need to be able to read the words accurately and fluently, and you need to understand the language conveyed by that text. And that's really all the simple view of reading is. It gives you those two things that you absolutely need to be successful. So reading is about being able to read words accurately and fluently, but it's also about comprehension. It's also, as I said at the beginning, about lots of other things too. So we can take a broader definition in thinking about engagement, thinking about behaviour, thinking about affect around reading, and I'm interested in all of those things. But I am going to focus primarily on proficiency today. So being able to read the words and being able to understand the messages conveyed by texts. So that is the simple view of reading, those two things. And we've already heard about that today, but I'm just going to give you one more thought on why the simple view of reading is a really useful framework for us, because it reminds us that we need to think about reading not just on one dimension, with young people ranging from being less proficient to more proficient readers on one dimension, but rather on at least two dimensions. And that's really important because those two parts of reading, that word reading part and that language comprehension or reading comprehension part, they don't always go hand in hand. So we can see kind of uneven profiles of strengths and weaknesses across those things. So we need to think about both of those things when we are designing our instruction, when we're identifying reading needs, and so on and so forth. And this just gives you a sense of where our young people might fall in this multidimensional space. So when Jennifer showed you the simple view of reading, she showed it quite differently from this. I like to plot it in multidimensional space so we can think about where our pupils sitting in front of us, where they are in this multidimensional space. Are they successful readers in the top right-hand quadrant? Or are they young people who have some kind of reading need, whether it be to do with word reading, language comprehension, or both? So we've heard also about the reading rope today, which is another way of expressing the simple view of reading, just with a little bit more detail. What I'm showing you here is the reading comprehension house, which again is just the simple view of reading. You've got the roof of reading comprehension and you've got word reading and language comprehension that are the bricks that are holding that up, but you've got a little bit more specification underneath that, just like you do with the rope. There are some minor differences between the rope and this approach, but they are broadly the same. And they're just helping us to unpick the kind of pressure points to successful reading in a little bit more detail, and also giving us a signal of what we might teach and what we can support through our interventions. So we've heard quite a lot about phonological awareness and phonics this morning, so I'm not going to focus on that now, except to say, of course, that it's fantastically important in amongst all of the other wonderful things that we need to do to promote reading. But I thought I would just take a little bit of time to think about reading comprehension, and just as a reminder, because we all find reading comprehension relatively easy. That will vary in the room, as it does for everybody, but we can all read successfully in this room. And I think what that does is it means that we forget how complex and challenging reading is. It's actually a really complex, multifaceted thing that you're doing every time you read a text. It is complex, it is constructive, it's iterative, and you are building that mental model of a text and you're adding things to it, you're changing things within it as you get new information. So it's dynamic, it's constructive, it's active. And sometimes our young people who find reading tricky don't realize that those others who can just do it seemingly by osmosis are actually working really hard when they're reading. That's often why we choose to do something else, don't we? Flick on our phones or watch TV instead of reading, because reading is actually hard. You know, we have to put a lot into it in order to get what we want out of it. It's also often what we find enjoyable about it, because we're really doing that constructing of the meaning. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit now about the research that I've done, just to give you a sense of what we know about reading across transition from primary to post-primary. So I'm going to talk about development, so what changes over time, and also variation, which, you know, as a kind of spoiler alert, variation is the thing that really matters. That's the thing that we find. So my research approach combines longitudinal and experimental approaches. So I follow children up over time, and I also conduct carefully controlled experiments that align with what we might seek to do in the classroom or seek to understand. And what that allows me to do is to understand what changes over time, the variations between young people, and also what relates to what and how. So what is the causality between vocabulary and reading comprehension, for example? Actually, it's reciprocal. So you see reading comprehension feeding into vocabulary and vice versa. So it allows us to tease apart those causal hypotheses. But importantly, and this is the most important thing, is that in every bit of research I do, I collaborate with colleagues such as yourselves. So everything that I do is guided by conversations and collaboration with practitioners out there in the field, because what that allows me to do is to ask the questions that are really important for your practice, and also to translate the findings I have so that they actually they're kind of translated into actionable things that you can go away and do. So hopefully I'll be able to do that a little bit for you today in the time that I have. So as part of my work then, I've done some large-scale longitudinal studies following young people up in early secondary and also in the transition from primary to secondary. So I'm going to talk about two projects here. One was led by Nicola Dawson, who worked with me some years ago, and then since then we've done a second project with Laura Shapiro and Sanne van der Kleig that you can see here. So my first question when I came to thinking about reading in secondary school, reading across transition, was what is going on? Actually, you might be surprised to know that when I came to this about 12 years ago now, there was very little information about reading in secondary schools and even less about what is changing and what the variation looks like. So actually the questions we asked at the beginning were really simple questions. And when we're thinking about development, of course we're interested in progress, but we're also interested in stability, and what that means is where you are in the pecking order. So if you line up 100 kids and you put them in order of how good they are at reading, is that the same a year later? Is that the same 2 years later? So we were interested in another developmental process called stability. We were also interested in spread, so the variability that we might see. And that's partly because there's quite a strong narrative out there about Matthew effects in reading. So that is the idea that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer in relation to reading over time. So we wanted to test out that hypothesis. So what did we find? Well, we found that there was significant growth over time. So kids were, in the later primary and early secondary phase, they were getting better at reading over time. So that's not rocket science, that is what we expect to see. I think what it is important to note, though, is that that progress is much slower than what you see earlier in development. So earlier in development, you've got the beginning stages of learning to read, and you don't see that kind of very marked progress over time, but you see important changes, and we do need to be mindful of that. There are really important changes in relation to reading happening in secondary school, and a lot of people told me that I wasn't going to see anything interesting when I embarked on this research, so I definitely proved them wrong in that respect. The stability is fantastically high, and that's something to be mindful of as well. So where you are in the pecking order age 12, let's say, is basically identical to where you are age 14. Now that doesn't mean that we can't do anything to intervene for those who aren't doing so well age 12. We absolutely can, but what we're doing is we are moving the distribution up rather than changing the order of children, if that makes sense. We also found that instead of a Matthew effect, with the kind of spread getting wider over time and the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, we actually saw a slight narrowing of the gaps, which was really positive, so a little bit of compensation. So a kind of counteracting message for that strong narrative about Matthew effects, which was based on much younger children. So at this age group, we certainly don't see the gaps widening. If anything, we see them narrowing a little bit. Now, what we were looking for were these developmental processes. What we actually saw that was the most marked thing was the sheer variability amongst our young people in the secondary phase. And that was a real surprise to us. We did expect things to be variable, but not this variable. Just to give you a kind of sense check on that, what we see in 14-year-olds is young people who vary from about the level that you would expect of an average 5 or 6-year-olds, so think about what that means in your practice, what 5 and 6-year-olds are doing, right up to adult levels. Now, what that means is that there is a huge challenge for anyone teaching a secondary class, right? Because you've got all of that range in front of you, and you've got to try and somehow cater to all of that. So that's a huge challenge for all of us who are working with young people. We do see very high levels of need as well, and that's those kids who are reading at about the level you would expect of an average 6-year-old up to an average kind of 8 or 9-year-old. So there are about 20% of young people in our secondary system who are working at that level. Now, of course, that's quite far away from where they need to be to access the curriculum that we're wanting to give them. So that's important to note as well. So what did we do next? As I said, that was very, very preliminary research looking at this, and really nothing had been done before. Well, we wanted to replicate and extend this, and we wanted to look at two things. So we wanted to look at all of those things, but in addition, look to see whether there was indeed a transition slump in reading as young people move from primary to post-primary. There is a very strong narrative out there about a slump in reading, and we wanted to actually test that properly, because it hadn't been done before. And what hadn't been done before is comparing that transition summer holiday with a non-transition summer holiday, and also using the same measures at the beginning of that phase and at the end of that phase. So people had, the evidence that had been used to support that narrative wasn't robust. So we wanted to to get some robust evidence to see whether that was the case. We were also really interested in disadvantage, and that's come up already, you know, that sometimes if we look at overall averages in relation to PISA, for example, what that masks is these high levels of need, and that actually these high levels of need can go hand in hand with other kinds of disadvantage that we already know about, and that's really important too. So what did we find in relation to development? Well, we found that we replicated with a completely different sample, much bigger sample actually, I would say in this case. We've replicated all of the things that we'd seen before, and that's really good news because you don't want to just see something once. You want to make sure you can see it again. And as I said before, this variability presents a real challenge for those who are engaged in teaching at this transitional phase. We did see these high levels of reading need, and one of the things that we wanted to note on that is really that we can distinguish between two different kinds of broadly distinguish between two different kinds of reading need. There are those reading needs that are identifiable early, and if we have really robust processes for getting involved early, identifying needs early, that's fantastically good. But those reading needs that we identify early may well show up again in secondary. So we need to be conscious that those young people will need support all the way through secondary. The other thing that we were very conscious of wanting to convey with our findings was that some reading needs only emerge later as the challenge of reading changes. So there are some young people who are doing fine, and then suddenly the challenge of reading really changes. They've got new curriculum texts, they need to do different things with the texts and so on, and that is when their reading needs emerge. So we need to be conscious of those late emerging reading needs, and that's why only focusing on early primary reading, though that's fantastically important, is never going to be enough, because we need to continue to support those who have early identified reading needs, and we also need to make sure we pick up those whose reading needs only emerge later. In relation to the transition slump, when we looked at this properly, we found that there was no transition slump. So that's a bit of a headline for you. I think what's going on there instead is a shift in challenge rather than a slump in ability. So we need to make sure we're joining things up with our primary and post-primary sectors. And what about the gaps? Well, encouragingly, what we saw was that the gaps between those from more affluent and less affluent backgrounds weren't widening, much like the kind of Matthew effect I was talking about before. But, you know, if they were narrowing it, it was only a little bit. So it's still something that we need to be very, very conscious of, that there are gaps, and we need to make sure that we're mindful of that. And finally, in addition to looking at proficiency, we also looked at engagement. So how much are our young people engaged with reading? Can we get them more engaged with reading? I'm sure it won't surprise many of you to know that teenagers don't read very much. So what can we do? Well, we ran this large naturalistic experiment. It was a little bit delayed by COVID, but we did manage to run it immediately after COVID. And actually we engaged young people very strongly when we were setting this up, and we were hoping that it was going to be a really positive kind of behaviour change approach to promoting reading. Actually, though, those who engaged with it did very well, but we didn't have high levels of engagement. And if I've got time at the end, I'm going to come back and talk to you a bit more about why we think that was the case. So I've talked about proficiency, I've talked about engagement. Of course, those two things are really related. So if you can read, you're more likely to read more. If you read more, of course, you will build those knowledge and skills. That's completely obvious. But I think what isn't necessarily obvious is that you need to have that proficiency first. So yes, we need to have integrated approaches that think about what we're doing around proficiency, what we're doing around engagement, but we need to make sure we get the proficiency right first. We need to make sure our young people can read, otherwise they won't be able to access all of this wonderful reading culture that we put in front of them, all of these opportunities. What does this all mean? So I've boiled everything down to 5 messages for you. So if we've got this huge variability, we need to know about reading. Every teacher needs to know about reading, every teacher in primary and every teacher in secondary. Don't worry about the transition slump. It's to do with challenge, and we can focus on the challenge. Reading is not just a primary issue. It can never just be a primary issue because those needs show up later. And also there are late emerging reading needs. We need to think about proficiency and engagement together. And if we want to do this and do this well and make the right decisions, we need to think about how we are identifying needs, and we need to use assessment to do that really carefully. I'm not going to dwell on that point today, but very happy to talk about it to anybody in the break if you're interested. Okay, so what I'm going to do now, just for a minute or two at the end, is introduce you to some of the CPD resources that I've been developing. They are tailored to the secondary context because that's where there was a huge gap in England. Now, this piece of CPD was co-created with a huge number of teachers. That's what that says, okay? So it's not my work. This is the work of many, many minds and many people all coming together. And I couldn't do it without them. And really what we wanted to do was create a very feasible, very short piece of CPD that would build confidence, capacity and capability across the entire secondary workforce. So that's what we're aiming to do. It's not an everything you need to know about reading and supporting reading, but it's something for everybody. That was very much the focus. So any maths teacher in secondary, any history teacher can do this CPD just to get them off the ground in terms of their knowledge about reading, which is where a lot of my colleagues working in secondary say that they are. So it's everybody's business. And what this, and I'll just show you this diagram here, what this training looks like is two packages. So there's a package for school leaders and a package for practitioners. And there's some guidance and a workbook, and then there are a set of videos that tell you about reading. So there are some research-led videos that say much the same as I've said to you today. And then there are also some really practical strategies that schools can use. As I said, it's not everything you need to know. It's just a first step. But that was very deliberate because that was what I felt was needed. I know how pressured all of you are who are working in schools. It's an incredibly busy job. You've got so many competing demands on your time. And so it was just about creating something that would be feasible and accessible and would get the buy-in across the entire secondary workforce. So we are moving on to develop some more substantial CPD at the moment, which is actually going to be launched in January. I was doing a bit of work on it this morning before I came. So we have got time, which is absolutely excellent, to give you my final word, which is that I think I have spent so much time working with teachers and colleagues such as yourselves in all of the research that I do. I have worked with young people and we have asked them questions about reading. But what we realized following our big experiment that worked but only for those who engaged with it is that we had been asking the wrong questions in the wrong way. And so what we set out to do in this project was to enable young people to ask their peers about reading. So taking ourselves out of the situation so that we don't hear a mixture of what they think and what they think we want to hear, that instead we get a truer reflection of what their perspective is. And also asking them the right questions. So what do you think, rather than we think that you think this, is it a yes or is it a no? Which I think we were a little bit guilty of having done. So I'm just going to play you this video now as a finishing point, because this was a culmination of that project. So some young people went out, asked their peers about reading, and then developed this wonderful video.
We wanted to find out more from teenagers themselves, so we spoke to our friends about their views on reading, their own knowledge around reading, and their reading habits. And this is what we found.
They had very mixed views on their love or hate for reading, with some saying that they would rather spend time doing what they deemed more enjoyable activities. Some teens say that any information gathered from a book could easily be gained from a YouTube video, which to them is more interesting. They also find that books can be overwhelming and find these books don't typically hold their attention. Sound familiar? On the other hand, some stated that reading allows them to use their imagination, just like when they were a kid. But this was only if the books were interesting to them. Maybe those old novels from school have scared some teens away from finding their own book interests.
Everyone was aware of the benefits of reading, which included vocabulary expansion, broader knowledge, and imagination stimulation. Only a few of them stated it helped them with their spelling, discipline, attention span, and mental health, e.g. de-stressing. This suggests that teenagers aren't fully clued up on the benefits of reading, as their examples were limited, leading them to only seeing the drawbacks of reading as opposed to the overwhelming benefits. For example, one of our friends labelled time spent reading as wasted time.
When asked what does reading mean to you, everyone said something along the lines of understanding and comprehending what they actually are reading. However, some saw it as a productive pastime, some a way of building beliefs and becoming self-aware, and for others a way to follow the social norm of reading for the aesthetic, whatever that is. Each teen had their own views and experiences with reading, showing reading is very individualistic, and to some, it's even their own escape.
Finally, Most of our friends that said they read regularly tended to read before bed, but mostly as a method of falling asleep instead of a form of enjoyment. They also find setting aside time to read hard due to prioritizing other forms of entertainment like watching TV or playing video games. One of them even stated it's not the fact that they don't want to read, but it was down to the fact that they couldn't set a time apart due to school demands and social media holds.
Based on our discussions with our friends, they are not fully aware of the benefits of reading. They know what it means to read but would rather use their phones or play games. Whilst only about a quarter of our friends claim they enjoyed reading, the ones that do enjoy it tend to use it as a form of escapism and relaxation. However, it's not clear what we can do to encourage the remaining 3/4. Perhaps one way could be to provide some guidance around how to identify your favourite genre or type of book, or how to identify the best time of day for you to read. Even reading 1 or 2 pages a day is a start, and you could slowly work your way up to more. Reading is a crucial skill to develop for many reasons, so it's important that we identify the things holding teenagers back from picking up a book.
So hopefully that's given you a sense of what they think. Sometimes when I've shown that video to teachers, they find it a bit depressing. I don't find it depressing at all, actually. I just find it really interesting because there's a lot of things there that resonate with what we think, but it's very interesting to hear what they don't say and what they do focus on. So it's not entirely the same as what I would have come up with had I done this. And I think that's the really important message, and also, wonderful to get them involved. Okay, so that's everything from me. So just a thanks to all the people that contribute to this research. It's always a huge team effort doing these projects. And thank you to all of you for listening. If you do want to get in touch with me, please do. You'll be able to easily find my email address. So please do. I'd love to hear your reflections. And I will be around at lunchtime as well if you want to come and find me. Okay, thank you so much.